Good evening and welcome. My name is Vanessa Navarro Maza, and I'm the Folklife Curator at HistoryMiami Museum. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our monthly Sip of History program. Sip of History delves into South Florida's past and present through moderated conversations with artists, activists, and community stakeholders from a variety of disciplines. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from our guest speaker, Neri Torres. Neri holds an MFA in dance with a minor in film from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She also studied at Instituto Superior Artes and Escuela Nacional de Instructores de Artes in Havana. Neri is the founder and artistic director of IFE-ILE Afro-Cuban Dance Company. Before speaking with Neri, we'll first turn it over to our featured mixologist, Gabriel Urrutia. Gabriel is the author of the book Miami Cocktails, an elegant collection of over 100 recipes inspired by the Magic City, and he'll be mixing our drink of the evening.
How's everybody doing? Good, good, good. So usually the weather, it's like raining right now in Miami. Surprisingly, at least where I'm at, it's not raining too much. But I wanted to create something a little bit lighter than what we usually created. We were creating some very boozy, heavy cocktails. But I wanted to go back to one of my favorites personally, which is sangria. I think we've seen it in so many different forms when you think of what the sangria is. And the sangria is really, I mean, it goes back, I would say, to probably the Greeks and the Romans. They were creating a form of what they would think is sangria called hippocras. And hippocras was basically a little bit of the wine, and of course water back then was bacteria filled, so you couldn't drink it on its own. So of course, one thing to kill bacteria, like we always say, of course drink responsibly, but with a little bit of alcohol added to it. So the cool thing about sangria is, much like a lot of the cocktails we see here in the United States, they take on 1 million, 2 million, 3 million different forms. And that's kind of what happened in sangria. So, you know, I like that. So you think of, for example, the daiquiri in Cuba, where it made its way to the sands of Miami Beach, and you see so many different colors and different fruits, very similar to sangria. It's something that is, it is very, open to other types of flavors. And I think that that's what makes it so special. I wanted to kind of jump into a little bit of the history of it, because obviously when we speak about the sangria, we have to go back obviously to Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal, you have, obviously we spoke about the Romans, so that form of that in the 1100s, when the Phoenicians are in Spain, they're also making a form of sangria as well. When the Moors conquer Spain in the 700s AD, you see kind of the wine industry really die down until 1492. That's where you kind of see the elevation and the rise of sangria once again. But you're probably wondering when it's made its way to the States, and there's actually what we pinpoint in kind of as beverage historians, and we actually pinpoint the World's Fair in 1964 in New York. There was actually a Spanish pavilion, and they started serving sangria at the Spanish pavilion. And what better way to get people excited about sangria than to put liquid to lips? So that's kind of a cool way to bring it to life. Of course, I'm gonna do it in my own way. I'm gonna Miami-fy a little bit. So this Miami kind of way of creating the sangria is not very traditional towards the way you would actually see it. And I have my ice ready here. But what I wanted to do, because I said I wanted to actually shake the cocktail, but just to make it easier, I actually want to just build it in a glass. But one thing is important. I think traditionally, you'll see in Spain, they'll be using a Rioja, a Tempranillo. But feel free to use your favorite wine, or maybe a wine that's a little bit more inexpensive. Remember, you're going to add layers of flavor to that. So kind of the big notes you're going to have is those beautiful fruity notes really coming out of sangria. Sometimes they have a form of brandy. Sometimes they have a form of fruit juice in there as well. Sometimes it's OJ. We're going to be using mango juice in here. And then I wanted to really balance that out really bring those kind of more acidic notes out of the wine. So it's going to be a little bit of lime juice, a little bit of sugar. And then, of course, an important part is actually getting all this citrus together and creating an actual kind of like a steeped cocktail. So you want that fruit to sit in there. So I have a little bit of a mandarin, orange, lime, I have some mint, and you want all that to almost marinate in your cocktail. So what I'm going to do is, and here's a little trick, by the way, when you are using herbs, right? So you have a little bit of mint here. What I like to do personally, I like to use the top of this as an actual garnish, but I'm going to take the bottom of this mint, kind of just pull that right off, right? And I'm going to put that and use it in my cocktail. But when I actually want to garnish the cocktail, you actually have a mint sprig that can go right into your cocktail. So always remember that, just little tips like that, which are pretty important. But of course, this is going to be a long cocktail, a refreshing cocktail. I'm going to add a little bit of the lime in the bottom. I'm going to put in a little bit of mandarin as well. And what I want is really just kind of to marry these flavors together. So first things first, the wine, I'm going to use 3 ounces of the red wine that I have here. Maybe a little bit more. I'm going to add that balance of a little bit of simple syrup. So this is 1 part water to 1 part sugar. And of course, I know you're very familiar when you see the sangrias served in pitchers. They're served in bigger bottles, and they're very, very large format. Of course, we want to serve this in large format. That's where you can actually steep a lot of the fruit. I didn't want all of you on a Thursday to actually make a pitcher if you weren't going to drink it. I'm big on waste. So we're going to make kind of a smaller one here. An important part, of course, I'm going to add a little bit of this ice that I chipped. So this is just chipped ice that I'm going to add to the actual cocktail. I get as much ice here as possible, and I want to get it to the top. And that's ice that I chipped on my own, beautiful clear ice there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to have the mint, I'm going to have the citrus all steeping there as well. I'm going to add an ounce of fresh mango, Palacio de los Jugos, by the way, just in case. So if you're from Miami, feel free to jump in there. They have a guava juice. You can actually order it by half the gallon now. So I like my very Miami things, right? So that's very Miami for me. So sometimes I can't get my guanábana from an actual fruit. Go over there and get your guanábana, which actually works great. And what I'm going to actually give this a quick stir real quick, because I want you to see how gorgeous that mango color, of course, the herbs and the citrus that's steeping in there. So we're not only going to be pulling the juice from the actual citrus, we're going to be getting the oils from the skin as well. We definitely want that in there, right? That oil essence. And when you smell that cocktail, it really, really pops. We want to pull that citrus out of there. And this is kind of like my Miami way to do it. Last but not least, I wanted to add just a little bit of spicy ginger beer. Of course, use your favorite ginger beer. Ginger beer you'll find at every supermarket now. Of course, very famous in a cocktail called the Mule. And that's going to be with a little bit of vodka, lime, and of course, ginger beer. But I love it in this cocktail because it's really going to kind of give it those champagne bubbles that you might have been looking for in a wine cocktail. But if you, at your house, have rosé, if you have Prosecco, if you have a Sauvignon Blanc, feel free to experiment with something that's maybe not a red wine. But what I want to do, of course, is just really complement exactly what we were doing with the wine, right? So the wine is the bigger part of the base here, 3 ounces. I wanted to add 1 ounce of the mango, and of course, ½ ounce lime, ½ ounce sugar, and then top with ginger beer. I'm gonna agitate the mint leaves a little bit because I really want that aroma to come through. This is the mint sprig that I told you that can act as a garnish. So that sits right there. And I am going to add a couple of those on top. And of course, my reusable metal straw that I use all the time. And should I take a sip of this? I think I should, right? A perfectly made Miami sangria. So thank you so much. And I will pause for any questions that you may have, which I doubt, because I think this one was nice and simple. I wanted to ease into the easing conversations. you guys are about to have, which I'm really excited about. And look, no storm and no rain. So thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to many, many more. And of course, we have the recipe has been emailed. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot a note out. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. This is delicious. Please join me in raising a glass to our guest speaker, Neri Torres. Welcome, Neri. So good.
Hola,
Hey.
salud.
Salud.
I have mine too. It's prettier than you.
I know.
Yours.
So, Neri, can you please start by telling us a little bit about yourself and telling us about your personal experience with today's topic of Afro-Cuban religion?
Well, my experience with Afro-Cuban religion comes from my family. Since I was little, my parents were really practitioners. They believe in like most Cubans, they believe in both the Catholic Church and the Afro-Cuban derived tradition, which is Santeria, and my grandma as well. And this had to do with the music, the dances, the smells, the foods that were cooked in ceremonies, and particularly the faith. Yes.
So before we dive into this topic, can you first tell us your thoughts on the term Afro-Cuban?
The term Afro-Cuban is, to me, quite conflicting, because for us Cubans, there's no division in what Cubanness is, like nationalism. We are all embedded in this idea, this imaginary that we are Cubans. So when I came to America, I realized that, well, there's this view of Cuban Black culture and Cuban white culture. So I think that I abided to this category because, wherever you go, you do what you adapt, in other words. But we have this in the culture that all Cubans are considered, from all colors are considered Cubans. And the most important thing is because Blacks were part of the independence war. So they had won the right to be part of that nationality in many ways. So even Antonio Maceo, which is the Titan of Bronze that everybody knows, that was the leader of those wars, was Black. And for most Black people, there's a pride behind that history. So for me, when I arrived to America and there was this Afro and this hyphen in between, was kind of like, I wonder, yes. But I think also I understand, compared to America, that there's a lot of issues in Cuban history that have been hidden in many ways. The problematization of race in Cuba has been written for centuries now. And I realized that there's ways of perception of race in many places. Cuba being one of those places where, race hasn't been totally discussed openly. Despite, we have, most of the culture is Black. Yes.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful to kind of start from there and set the foundation there. And then now we can kind of dive into to the religious aspect of the conversation. So can you tell us a little bit about the roots and the history of Afro-Cuban religion, specifically Santeria, Lukumi, Orisha worship? And can you also touch upon how the perception of the religion has changed over time in Cuba?
The roots of the Santeria come from, the colonial times, when, particular slavery, there were a lot of ethnic groups that were taken from, actually the territorialized, from Africa to the called New World. And Cuba being the biggest of the island, something that people lose as perspective. There were tons and tons, thousands of people that were displaced to the island. so what is known today as Santeria has basically, that is formed by the practices of people in Nigeria, today's Nigeria, that at that time was composed by several villages like Benin, Osogbo, and so on. And also in that tradition, where we have is historically the syncretization that happened behind all the actual African religion, how Black people were able to, and which was very strategic, was not really something that most of the time people tend to accuse all these Africans that were in the New World as people that didn't have any intelligence, or that were really didn't have a knowledge. But it was something very clever, and it took thought to plan to keep their traditions alive by hiding behind the imposed tradition, which was Catholicism. And they were able to see the things in common that Catholicism had, in order to really find that way of hiding behind each of the saints of Catholic Church. So the many saints that Catholic Church represents. So for instance, you have San Lazaro, and that was represented by Baba Loaye, and Santa Barbara with Chango, because the specific avatars of this Yoruba orishas, which are called orisha, meaning gods of deities. So what they had suffered during their time on the earth, because they have characteristic of humans, and that is called anthropomorphic. So they have anthropomorphic characteristics, and they were able to find the points in common, the commonalities, in order to create their own traditions. So that's the root behind that, but it doesn't stop there. There's this discussion about how Santeria maintain the old tradition of the Yoruba, and there was something, a certain percentage of Catholicism in it, because all the ceremonials are happening in Yoruba language, and pretty much in 1977, when one of the Obas from Benin came to Cuba, they said that, he said that we still practice the language like all the Yoruba, same as saying the English of Shakespeare. So, but also, on the other hand, there's all the traditions from the Africans that came to Cuba, like the Congos, that also were infused in Santeria in a certain extent. So there's this kind of to reside in coexist in peacefulness that happened with all these beliefs. So we also have the Palomayombe, and then you have the Arara traditions that were similar because they came from the same tree, and also the Awakwa, which is a sect of all male. This is an all male society sect. Yes. So this is kind of like the background of what we have. And all these people brought their music and their beliefs, because the African aesthetic is very geared and connected to spirituality. So in the diaspora, we all dance, and people think, well, we dance because it's a crazy Black people. No, we dance because in our roots, we have this belief, and this connection with spirituality is very strong. It comes from the African beliefs. And the way of actually being and connection with the higher powers was really being what we call nowadays an artist, right? A musician, a singer, a painter. So
That's
I hope
really
that
interesting how that's really interesting how it's you know, not only the language, but the music and the artistic aspects of the practice is what contributed to the preservation. You had mentioned, obviously, there was a sense of having to hide these practices, if there was, you know, having to kind of with the syncretism and having to practice under the guise of Catholicism. Can you talk to us about how the perception of the religion, how about people being open to practice, how that kind of changed over time, and kind of maybe take us through a timeline to today?
Yes, I think that in that time there was this need to hide. Then you have in the 30s that when Fernando Ortiz started his anthropological studies, that he realized that this culture had a value for not only for anthropological purposes, but for the country, because Cuba was coming out like a new nation. And it is said that in 50 years, all these resistance and all this conversation among cultures came through a fruitful creolized forms that we are still enjoying today. So I think that in the 30s, with the studies of not only Fernando Ortiz, but La Chatañere and Lidia Cabrera, people were able to realize what was the real value of this tradition, what was the value of this tradition behind the Cuban culture, and how it really helped permeate what Cubanness was about.
And how
Then
about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, then I think that there was an issue with that idea as well, because it was a door open to also exploiting the forms to the advance of politicians. So sometimes you have I think in the 20s that they have this conga called a chambelona, although these politicians many times prohibited the practices of the Blacks in terms of music and chants and all of the above. At some point, they also utilized to the benefit their music in the dance. So the La Chambelona was a very popular song that was used to move the career of, I think it was, I forgot the Menocal, I think it was during Menocals, if I recall correctly. So they used that when they were having elections in order to promote the candidates. So there's been a lot of appropriation and misutilization of the Black culture in Cuba, and later on we can see that still happens nowadays, where Cubans are really invisibilized and don't have much right to and much say about the culture.
And can you tell us, did anything change in 1959? Like in terms of the way of the perception and of the practice and the years following?
Yeah, in 1959, coming the revolution, there was a return to nationalism. Once the American blockade came to effect, Cuba was close to the world. But then the music was already out there. That's one of the things I have in my research. So it was a close of the frontier between Cuba and the world, where the Cuban body was kept in the island and the culture was outside, still around in the world. And then the most important thing in 1959 was that the revolution created these institutions in order to rescue and reshape what Cubanness was about. Because we had this total closeness from the entire world, there was like a look inside to the root of what Cubanness was about. And in doing so, a lot of companies came about, like the Conjunto Folclórico Nacional and Danza Nacional de Cuba, now it's called Danza Contemporánea de Cuba. And even in 1940s, this idea of, some people don't know that even in the 40s, Alberto Alonso was creating ballets with Black themes. Back in 1947, I think was the first ballet he created. And all this idea of the coexistence of Black and whites, although they were in different levels, there was a primacy of Black culture as representation of Cuba. Although we had operas and zarzuelas, and even Italian operas were there, and there were groups that sang opera. People study all the classicals. The root, what really nourished Cuban culture, was Blackness. And then in 1959, what happened is that with this institution, there was like rescuing all these forms that first were marginalized in the imaginary of the Cubans. Although there were all this music were used, like the rumba and the son and all those all those forms. Um, but then when in the 90s, the special period happened in 90 when um, the socialist bloc ended. Cuba was found herself without any support from any of the former countries that were socialist countries. So there was a big crisis. We in Cuba we've been cyclic with all these crises, and this was one of the worst, other than the one that they have today nowadays. And the resources, one of the resources that the government saw fit was utilized in the culture. So they rescue all this idea of the big shows that happened in the 20s and 30s when the mafia was around in Cuba. The big cabaret shows like in Tropicana, in Montmartre, and all those famous shows where everybody used to go to Cuba and watch from the big figures of Hollywood, from Georgia Raft and Marlon Brando. And they rescued this idea of the big spectacle and started to sell it to Europe. So that was in the 90s. And in my research, I have that migration being one of the most important to not only the 80s. Let me go back because I think I spoke before time. There was the 1980s. How can I forget? That was a real game changer for my family and for many Cubans in the Maria boat lift. That was the first time when people really realized that in America that there were a lot of Black people in Cuba. For some reason, people didn't do their homework about the history of Cuba. So in that 1980s, before the special period that happened in 1990s, the Mariel Bolif brought a lot of practitioners and musicians, and this is when rumba and orisha dance and religion started to settle in New York, and started to also become fruitful in Puerto Rico as well. Mm-hmm. So and then nowadays you still have the rumba in I think it's in, what is the name of the big park in New York? The Central Park. Central Park. Yes, and well, it comes in 1990s, and all these spectacles started to be exported. And there was also the return of many people that had left in the first wave of migration that have family in Cuba. And people started to see that there were other means of finding life other than the ones that had been promised to all Cubans. And many of the dancers started to migrate to Europe, particularly Black dancers. There's a big migration of Black dancers that hasn't been documented. That's part of my research. So, and I think they brought with them this, and most of them, there was a big amount of these dancers that were formally trained, both in modern dance, ballet, or traditional Afro-Cuban dances. And I think that's when there was a boom of this tradition started to spread in Europe, and some of them here in America to the in a less quantity. I am one of them. So, but I think that it being a game changer for all the spaces of community places where people start to reclaim their right to dance and the right to experience sensuality and being transformed by all these traditions in many ways. And also you can see nowadays that it's more than 100,000 of practitioners of Santeria in places so never heard of that this tradition would occur, like Japan, Russia, Yugoslavia, or and Mexico. There's a big community of Orisha practitioners as well. They know the songs, they learn the dances, but then what happens, which could be a good thing for Cubans in terms of the culture being out there. There's been also a marginalization of Cubans in many ways. and lack of recognition. When people say, well, the claves are Cuban, they say, no, the claves are African. So this is the only culture where people cannot claim their what they created in their Creole, and as a Creolized society, you know? Like you have here in America, not hip hop, but tap. Let's talk about tap. Tap is a combination of Irish clog and black dances.
Hmm.
And nobody says, well, tap is Irish. Nobody dares to say that. See, however, for Cubans, because we're not there, people feel that they have the right to, and they are able to do it because Cuban cannot contend it to say that our drums belong to straight to Africa, or appropriation of things like what we call salsa nowadays. And even in many books, academics have been complicit of not recognizing the origins of these dances in many ways, and even the practitioners in many ways. Practitioners that are now part of the tradition, they just go to look after Africa, and they don't look at Cuba as one of the most important centers of spreading these traditions, and also to cultivate it and promote it and keep it. So that for one, in one hand, we had the government that was benefiting from this exploitation of the culture, and not really doing what they need to do to protect it. I think, and one of the things I theorize is because it's coming from Blackness, from African traditions that were not really taken into consideration, and it were always minimized because of this historic colonialism. And on the other hand, I also think that the blockade have really stopped many of the possible claims that Cuba can actually sustain for retaining the culture. And on the other hand, neoliberalism has allowed all these cultures to be really taken advantage of commercially. So nowadays we're still struggling with that idea. Now that most of my colleagues and people that my classmates and practitioners, we are all with our hands, like you were saying, normally we are really trying to figure out how to really rescue our histories and our narratives, because there being other people that come onto Cuba, they do their research and they speak about their perspectives, but the Cuban perspective is not listened to. We almost don't exist. And us as immigrants, I feel that we have to guarantee this continuity and also clarify the facts that Cuba was there for a long time, and and now we don't only have a real curtain, but also we lost the right to contain our culture.
Wow. There's so much there. There's so much there. I mean, what I would do to kind of turn the direction of the conversation, you've talked a lot about migration and the effects of the way that the culture, the religion, the dance, the music is seen kind of on like a world stage in popular culture. I'd love to talk a little bit more about how migration has affected the preservation of like the individual practitioners and this practice within smaller communities, within families. Migration, whether forced or voluntary, has been a part of the religion's history from its very beginnings. When enslaved West Africans were forcibly taken to Cuba with absolutely nothing, and they were able to reconstruct aspects of their religious practices in a completely new environment and under unimaginable circumstances. And Cubans coming to the US or, going, anywhere in the world, often leave or come with little to nothing, and are also able to kind of reconstruct their religious practice. So I would love if you could tell us a little bit about how individual practitioners adapt to the changes that come with moving to a new place and reconstructing their culture and their identity in a new environment. And if you can also, if you're comfortable, to kind of share your own journey, migrating and reconstructing your culture and identity in a new place.
Right. I think that's what most immigrants do. And particularly dancers, we are always traveling, and this is not new. Only globalization has accented this type of traveling. But we in Cuba have this karmic experience with readapting, like our ancestors, the Africans. In many of us, when we travel, we bring our music, we bring our dances and our religion with that. In the same way that we learn from our ancestors, the most important thing on this is memory, that's what was missing from your question. Memory is the important tool to reconstruct anything that you had before. So you could be in jail for 20 years, you come back and you remember everything, and you could, from your memory. And that's how you reconstruct things. And then you find substitutes for those, the things that are missing. So you had this drink. Look at Urrutia was creating a new sangria. So that sangria is very representative. We spoke about it, about these changes that happen with culture. Culture doesn't stay unmovable. You get influenced too. But then there's two things about culture that are interesting. There's this culture that happened for the African people when they settle in the New World, that they had to readapt and transform under certain duress. And there's the one that we are being forced upon by neoliberalism and globalization. Mm-hmm. So we have, and some people need to really take hand of other culture in order to make money, or other dances in order to recreate themselves, which is totally different than readapt, but the socialization and transformation organically happening in a specific environment. So what I see right now is that there's some sort of green light to all sorts of appropriations. Mm. And I think that's certainly problematic for the sense of belonging and identity for many people, like Cubans, particularly because that's what we're speaking about. But the thing that does not only happens to us, happen to most people in the Caribbean when they travel, or from people that, from Asia. You have this idea of your identity is being taken by something that like your step or like your music or like something, and you as a creator keep yourself marginalized and not having access to those resources that other people were able to construct based on your own tradition, Mm-hmm. So that's what we see a lot nowadays. The right to claim our own cultures is not there. It's slowly coming. It's people having a voice now with these post-colonial philosophies and all these constructs. We're able to claim our spaces, but I see that is problematic because the invisibilization is, stops you from getting what you need in terms of what you have, Mm-hmm. So what you have is not enough, but it's enough for others. So, and there's this sociologist, Jamaican sociologist, Stuart Hall, who said that marginalization hasn't been so profitable as nowadays, because most entertainment industry and most people that are in the show business just capitalize on it in many ways. And that has been happening for a while now.
Yes. Neri, how do you see your work and the kinds of things that you focus on? How do you see that as a part of this conversation, as a part of that reclaiming?
My work, the funny thing is that I studied like almost little kids in Cuba. There were little girls. I wanted to be a ballerina because we had the figure of Alicia Alonso, which is big, such an important figure in dance in our culture, and she created a whole school and style that people look after. And then I discovered modern dance. And I said, this is something that is even better for my body. But then I am migrated and I say, who am I?
Mm.
And that question of identity and the loss of your land makes you look inside. And then I said, well, I think that what defines me is this tradition. And this is what I need to really rescue. The rest doesn't need rescuing. And really visibility. So that's how I embraced the folkloric forms in my company. Although we still do a lot of fusion and modern and stuff like that. So I think that that's one of the missions of my company, to promote and cultivate and create conversation and understanding about culture, particularly based on the dances and music of the Afro-Cubans.
Mm. You've already talked a little bit about this, but I wonder if you can just expand on it, about the some of the influences and contributions of Afro-Cuban culture in the United States specifically.
Right. Well, you know that when Cuba became a republic, that in 1910, there was a pact between American government and the government that was entering, Tomás Estrada Palma at the time. So there was some sort of assistance, let's call it, from Cuban and American in those terms, because they didn't want to have the same thing happened before with the independence world, that all the Black people wanted to, their freedom, and people that were against the Spanish. So we lost our chance to independence, to get to another sort of dependence. Mm. But the good thing about our country is that we never really played the total dependence and annexionism to America. So there was always this idea of we are independent. And that's what Castro had in his imaginary as well. But I think that what happened in that time, I lost my thread of thought. We were talking about
contributions.
Contributions, right. There you go, contribution. Yeah, the contributions. So there was this continuous coming and going from American culture to America. So the culture of Cuba started to travel to America as well. So in 1920s, you had the radio coming out, and most of the music of Cuba started to travel all the world. And that led into the golden times of Cuban culture was the 30s through the 50s. So most of the dances and music that was produced in Cuba was replicated and it was diffused around the world. Cubans didn't need to travel at the time. We had a fair economy that where everybody went to Cuba, and there were conflicting presidents, but still there was certain richness in the economy, in some of the economies, that many things were constructed, and culture at Cuba was flourishing. So that cannot be denied. There were social issues, but I think that there were presidents that really produce a certain stability in the economy. Mm-hmm. But what happened is when the music started to migrate, Cubans didn't need to migrate at that time. Only when there was certain migration that happened in minor scale during the tenure of Batista, mm-hmm. right before the revolution. And most people used to go to Cuba because that was the playground for Americans. So you can see all these contributions in jazz, in the creation of jazz, and what people call today salsa, although they deny that it comes from Cuba in many ways. It's really ironic that how the scholars had, close files to not really recognize Cuban's contribution to American music and even international, what is called Pan-Latinism. One of the other things there were a lot of big bands and many dancers that are now recognized, because mostly in the arts, dancers are always obscured, but there were couples that traveled with the bands and really taught the people how to dance Cuban dances out there. And then even during the Catherine's Donna Company, there were a lot of black drummers playing for her. Most of the players, for if people don't know this, and most of her players were Cubans. And she even did the choreography with this piece called Rumba back in 1933 or 34. So there was a very, people were really in tune with what was happening musically and dance-wise in Cuba. So you have the mambo, cha-cha-cha, all those rhythms and all those dances really injecting American pop culture. Then you have somehow the caricaturization. I speak so fast, I'm sorry, that's my way of being. My sister always used to tell me I speak fast, and I think faster than I speak. But anyway, that's why I write it. But then you have even Desi Arnaz playing Babalu, and people, Americans start to sing Babalu, and they don't even know what the heck is Babalu, So, and the funny thing is that Desi Arnaz, his father, prohibited the music for the black people in Oriente all the time. He was a politician that was against black music. So one of the interesting points of history. And then his son became famous and rich with playing Babalu. But anyway, this is one of the things that I wanted to point out. The contributions of Cuban music, I think they're one of many, from music creation, the instruments from the claves to the pailas to the congas. People call it congas, we call it tumbadoras. Mm-hmm. And yeah, they were a contribution from the Congo culture in Cuba, but they were a total creolized form of drums made in Cuba, and this is not recognized. Mm. Then you have the way of playing the bata drum. So what people practice nowadays in America, most of them is a Cuban-derived practice. Many of them will say, well, I'm going to Africa to get initiated and there's this controversy about many Cuban whites being the religion. But again, we're going back to that idea of Cuban being, thought of an imaginary of Cubanists where black and whites are together. But then all these issues of race are being hidden under. Mm-hmm. And this takes for a whole dissertation, trust me. But yes, most of these people that get initiated in America, they now go to Africa. But then the way they discover the tradition is by all these people that are migrants around the world that have been able to plant the seed and allow these people to rescue the spirituality, and mm-hmm. It's not being recognized properly. Mm-hmm.
You've talked a lot about how elements of Afro-Cuban culture have been erased and exploited. Can you, if there's anything else you wanted to add to that, but if you can also talk about how elements of Afro-Cuban culture have been stigmatized in Cuba, in the US, even in other countries around the world.
Well, again, we're going back to this idea of colonialism, how Black-derived culture is always being locked down. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And then in that manner, Black culture in Cuba was always banned at some point or another. When Carnival happened, when the Itemes were out in the street, Babacua, people were scared of them because what people don't understand, they just fear and just prohibit and just go against. That's one of the things that happens when you don't know about another person. And that's why I love dance, because you are able to break that space with people. Once they start dancing with you, you loosen up, you don't have any other way. But then they were scared of that, the race of people against the whites in Cuba in many ways, in many times. And at some point, there were more Black people, more Black enslaved than whites. And when the Republic came, that all the abolitionism happened in 1868, I believe, 1896. That's when Cuba was the last country together with Brazil to abolish slavery. And that's another detail, that slavery is still recent in Cuba. So I am fourth generation of free persons in my family. My great grandmother was a slave, and she said she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And she always tells me that, she used to tell my grandma, I didn't meet her, that she was coming from Ethiopia. And she was walking, all those people walk a lot. My grandma used to walk from Matanzas to Havana. That's like coming from
Wow.
Orlando to Miami. So, in Africa, people walk, and mostly in that time, that was, that was the way of life. So she just told us that, yeah, she had to cook to earn her freedom. So I have that tradition of great cooks in my family.
Mm.
So my grandma told me that she met Antonio Maceo, when he was wounded in one of those battles. She always tells us the story growing up. And then my mom was born, and then I was born. So this fourth generation, the third generation free, actually.
Wow.
All these strong women are in the family tree. And also I have a grandma who was a great dancer in Pinal del Rio. She used to dance for the, what do you call that? The yuca drums, the yuca macuta for Congo derived. She said that she was such a great dancer that all women were jealous of her. So yeah, we have that history, and the good thing is that we know our history. That you can and I realize how we done in terms of displacing our culture, sharing with others. We have this idea of community in our cultures, in particular, and I know we inherited that from ancestors, the blacks, and even from the Spanish part of us, because we don't only have black. Mm-hmm. So people don't realize that in Cuba, the culture comes from Spain, and the culture that came from Spain from Sevilla. And Seville is one of the places when there was a lot of where slavery actually occurred in a way that they have this, how do you call the cabildos? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this type of organization of mutual aid, that's the way. And they started in Seville, and Spanish wanted to imported this into Cuba. So those people that were in Seville, those black people were brought during the discovery of Cuba to Cuba. So people know that before slavery, they were already, we have a second hand of black people coming. So that's why Fernando Ortiz called it, Cuba was black twice, from Spain and from Africa.
Wow.
So, there's a lot, and I see that's why people identify so much with our culture, because it has for so many places, mm-hmm. in many ways. So thinking about that, how that sangria again, all that contribution from people from here and there made something so interesting and so enjoyable for so many. Mm-hmm. So it powers transformation. So I was talking about community. You have this idea of the ego is not part of, although there's ego, but in terms of culture, there's this idea of sharing and creating groups and communities. And that's what Cubans do. Wherever we go, I think we create that type of setting when you bring people and you share your culture. I think that's part of what we do. It's just, I think, what we inherited from our ancestors, mm-hmm. and we replicate that from memory again. Yeah, mm-hmm. And it's something that is part of our identities in many ways.
It's beautiful. I think that we'll move on to Q&A, but I wanted to give you a chance if there was anything else, any important points, any ideas you wanted to make sure that we talked about before we open it up for questions. I know there's like...
Oh, you were talking about the rejection of the stigma of the culture. I think I didn't finish on that now that I realized. So yeah, I wanted to say that, yeah, Black culture in Cuba was stigmatized since the beginning of the revolution. Not the beginning of the revolution, sorry about that. The slavery, since the beginning of colonial times. Mm-hmm. And then they've been banned from several different opportunities, to a point that the drones were banned and people had to use boxes, boxes from candles, boxes, fish boxes, but they kept the culture alive. These people were really rebels, and they knew what they were doing. They were really, there was this saying that my sister was always telling me, my sister was also a researcher. She said, a lo que vinimos, what we came here for. So it was what the people came there to, and that's what it's called regla de ocho, is to maintain the tradition. So regla is a rule. So all these people got together and gathered and recreated this culture, and in order to survive what was coming. And somehow they knew, because of readings that they did previously before they left, before they were taken, that this was going to happen. So they always say, this is what we came here for. So and somehow I think that we are, like history and karma repeats, it's cyclic. So I think our Cubans, we are suffering all this that made our ancestors suffer somehow. But yeah, the stigma has been there. Even although the revolution put out there most of the tradition, I think there's still this fight of the revolution now recognizing Black people in the media properly, So we still have this stigma. So there's a contribution still the same as the slave. You have the culture, but you don't want the body associated to it. So it's the same thing that is happening to Cubans right now. So the Cubans are not there, but the culture is outside, and everybody profits from it. So that's how I feel it. That's how I see it.
What are things that kind of give you hope, that you see as successes right now, that you feel like are moving in the direction that you would want?
Well, I think that we all are a grain of sand, and the contributions come from all the people and what you do in your spaces. And I gather from my research, I was talking with a lot of Cubans that are displaced in the several places in Europe and here. And we all have the same conclusion. We just have to keep going and keep the tradition alive. And we have to pass it out to people that are not Cubans, but still in passing to them, we have to make sure that we transmit it in a proper way and tell them what they need to know about it. So don't have another person intimidated telling them the story. We have to get the reins of our own narratives.
Right. Thank you, Neri. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Let me see what questions we have here in the Q&A box. Let me see. Well, this is an interesting question. How do you feel about the culture being part of the big stage? Do you see this as a negative or a positive? So, the presentation of the culture like in a secular sort of setting.
Well, I think that unfortunately, because of the times that we are living in, and this is not endemic to Cuban culture, most traditions have to have this Western stage presentation to go to in order to survive. So it has an ambivalence. From one hand, you promote and keep the culture alive, and from other, you are kind of dismissing certain contexts that you cannot replicate. But I think that mostly it's because economically, all our cultures are being, left behind from the visible arena. So from one hand, yes, you need to subsist. This is about sustainability. And many cultures, not only ours, Hawaiian culture, Asian culture is doing so. But the thing is, how do you stage and respect what is behind that background that is informing your movement? If you respect it, then you're good, and then if you always give credit and you always come back to that, because culture has to move on. And if we have this environment, you have to adapt. Organism that doesn't adapt perishes. That is a fact.
Interesting. Let me see what else we have. We have a lot of questions. You had mentioned the government did not do a good job in protecting the culture. What else could be done in your perspective?
Well, I think that there's a lot of composers that are out there, and the people utilize, and they were not given credit, proper credit. I think that there should be a campaign or something that the government should do in order to really reclaim those things. For instance, cha-cha-cha is one of the musics more used in American culture. Cha-cha-cha and bolero is one of the two sound. You can hear songs for the Beatles, they have cha-cha-cha. You can use, and then there was Marvin Gaye used cha-cha-cha. Santana used cha-cha-cha. And then, do people know who's the creator of cha-cha-cha? I had the honor to work with him, Enrique Jorrin. He used to live around the corner of my house.
Oh my gosh.
And then he died, poor, a regular guy. And he created a rhythm that we're still profiting from it.
Wow.
So I know that we have the blockade, but there have to be ways and institutions to reclaim all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that one of the things that the government have done is really exposing the culture, but how do you protect that, the people that produce the culture? Even Benny Moré, in English, Benny Moré was one of the greatest singers of all time in Cuba. And his catalog was bought by, I think it's Columbia Records. So Cuba did a movie about him and they had to use an extra to sing his songs. So what are we talking about? So, from one side you speak of, we have the cultural hegemonic of America, and then you have Cuba trying to, doing whatever they need to survive. But I think that in order to do whatever you need, you have something that is valuable because it was already outside. So how do you create legislations and speak in institution in order to preserve that? Because that doesn't belong to the revolution. That belongs to the people of Cuba as a country. So I am not a lawyer, but I think that there should be some sort of legislation and discussions about that. And again, you have these violent transitions in Cuba that the government confiscating properties and things like that. And there's a lot of issues behind the way that the transfer of power occur in Cuba. But still, to Caesar what is from the Caesar, So if this is a culture that represents a country, the government's job is to protect it. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. Bringing the conversation here to Miami, we have someone who asked, do you feel that Black Cuban culture is appreciated and valued here in Miami?
I think we have a conflict. That's an interesting question. I think we have a conflict of beliefs. You have in the 60s where came the historical hairstyle. They were supposedly the people that had the money and the ability to leave the country because they were wealthy, most of them, or they were well off, as opposed to the blacks that were their workers. And these people were more into white culture, Western derived culture, although they also identify as Cubans and they see son, which is one of the forms of Cuban dance and music, representing them. On the other hand, forms like rumba, oricha, Congo, that are more Black, more marginalized, they don't identify with it. So there's a problem of what identify these people and what identify the Blacks in Cuba. Some Blacks, most Blacks, And there's Blacks in Cuba that don't identify with rumba or oricha either. I grew up thinking about ballet, So despite the fact that my parents were practitioners. So there's this, again, this is problematic of race being under the bus and not being discussed openly. What identifies the country and what not, So in saying so, I think that here in Miami, we have detractors of practitioners, the ones that are more Christian or Catholics, and they don't identify with the practitioner of Santeria, and are always calling the police to a tambor or something like that. And then you have them, practicing whatever it is. But one thing is sure, whenever all those people listen to a conga, they go and dance. So there's something about Cuban culture that is Black and that resonates across race and a walk of life.
Mm. We have a really interesting question here. Would you classify or consider Cuba today to be an Afro-Caribbean country?
well, again, we're going back to that Afro and the hyphen, you know? So the Caribbean per se is that place where Benitez Rojo called everything is chaos, you know, the theory of chaos. Everything is chaos because we have Chinese. My great-grandfather was Chinese. So I cannot say I'm black totally. So that's the dilemma of people in the diaspora, because we cannot claim totally we're black. Look at my color. You know, I am black. My grandmother was black, but then she married a Spanish guy who she loved very much, and he loved her crazily. You know, so this is about humanity now. You know, I think is, you know, pretty much that's what this is about, and how do we all of us respect our identities and where we're coming from. You know, not only culturally but physically.
Let me see here. Do you believe to be the cultural appropriation? Do you believe to be cultural appropriation the generalized practice of Afro-Cuban religion by an increased segment of non-Black Cubans? So yeah, what do you think about the practice of?
It's the same question. We are in a dilemma in terms of nationalism. They're
Right.
Cubans. They have the right to practice that culture. And again, it's the good thing about Santeria that it's open. It's one of those religions that doesn't discriminate, bro, gender or class or walk of life. You know. So for us, what happened is when this religion started, there was the prohibition, always has been a prohibition. And some people got together, same as it is said that Petit was one of this figure that allowed white people to be practitioners in order to protect the rest, the right of the rest to practice. So from that time, I believe that was the beginning of the 20th century, or the end of the 19th century. I have to go back to that. But since that time, all these people from Spanish descent started to get initiated in our practices. So this is not for now. This is for a long time that being there in the practice. Some of the African derived practices, and they're Cubans, so they were allowed because of to guarantee the continuity of the practices. So again, we have this dichotomy of to be or not to be somehow. So what is Cuban at this point? So, and that's what happening right now. All Cubans believe they're Cuban. So you have whites acting like blacks and blacks acting like whites, and most of the time, blackness is the one that is in the streets. And one of the things that say is Cuban is more Afro. I forgot to finish that thought. I think that yes, we are pretty much mixed. Some people claim their Spanish background, but still there's a culture that is cohesive for all of us, and that culture is Black. There's no doubt about it. And that's one of the things that Fernando Ortiz talked about. And the funny thing that Fernando Ortiz was against the Black people. If you read the Los Negros Brujos, you read that he was against the Blacks at some point, until he realized there was all these currents talking about all the contribution of Black people did. So there was the movement for the Africanist movement, the one that what the boys had here too at the time. So all those movement Pan-Africanists were discussed in France and all the more important academies around the world, and they realized that there was, of course, there is importance in all the contribution of Africans and African descents to the patrimony of the humanity.
I have a question here. Let me see. Okay. This is the last question I have here. Some of these we've already answered, like somebody asked about the term Afro-Cuban, but please continue to send in your questions. So this question is, do you think the dance and culture have been sexualized with the influx of European tourism, and especially the sexualization of Cuban women?
Of course. I mean, and that's not, and the funny thing that people point fingers to Cubans, but this is, prostitution has been one of the oldest practices in the world. And sexualization of the culture has been one of the things that the government had taken hand on in order to replenish again their economy.
Mm.
And it's not endemic from Cuba. Again, this happens all through South America, and even here in America. You know, sexualization is one of the things that gives more money. It's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in the world. So how Cuba was going to be behind that? So not that it's okay, but I think that if you think about it, this is what is the premises of the government to create something like that with the culture, to allow the culture to happen. Because, you know, the rest of the world is doing it too. Although initially the government say, well, we are where we're based more in a more Puritan philosophy, then little by little, because of economic pressures, they have to relax all these ideals.
Yeah. So, you know, we don't have any questions, but I have a couple questions.
Okay.
Just my own curiosity. You talked about this a little bit at the beginning of our conversation, but I'd love to know about you personally, how music and dance connect you to your religious traditions and your spirituality.
I think that, you know, I always say dance comes from ritual. You know, the beginning of dance was ritual. Once you become a dancer or an artist, you always have this altered state of being, altered state of consciousness. And in our tradition, that was part of it. Whenever we go to a tambor or we go to a party or we go, you know, we have this idea of setting free, be transformed as humans. So forget about the worries and forget about the, you know, the hardships. That's the only moment that you can really get transformed as an individual. When you start dancing, when you start playing music, when you share the space in celebration with other people. And yeah, and this tradition has the power of doing that in many ways. And I see it all the time whenever, you know, whenever I see people dancing, or I dance with people, or I teach people, you know, the enjoyment of the joie de vivre, you know.
I don't know if what you just said is the answer to this next question, but what are the aspects of your culture and your religious practice that you value the most?
I think, for starters, there's some sort of self-reassurance and self-esteem that provides people with tools in order to face anything. You have someone who guards you. You're a representation of a power higher than you, and that gives you certain security. And also you have tools in order to do things in order to get out of troubles sometimes, and ask if you have a problem. And so I think because of all these many instruments and technologies that the tradition has, it allows you to, I think, being psychological more balanced in many ways. That's what I see. And you have a community that you can go to as well.
Yeah, like, you know, beyond the practice, it's you know, a form of survival in an unimaginable situation. You know, it goes beyond these are the things I do because this is my tradition and we do this on these days. It's almost necessary to be able to even go on in the rest of your life. It's so embedded.
How do you go on? Yeah,
it's so embedded. It's different from, you know, other religious practices where it's like, you know, on Sundays you go to church kind of thing. Not that you might not pray during the week, but it just seems like it's something that is so much more entrenched in not only the sense of self, but in like your existence, you know, especially in difficult situations, in being in new environments. And like, even when you were talking about, you know, when you came here to the United States and certain questions that you were asking yourself, like, who am I? you know, what's important to me now that my perspective has changed, and how the music and the dance and the practice is kind of helps you find the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, replicate that space. You see that it's missing, the context is missing. So how can you reproduce it? That's one of the things. And then again, this tradition was particularly the practice, the religious practice, was with people that didn't have anything.
Right.
And they share the little they have in these practices. But it has come to a point that it become an enterprise that I feel ashamed of, because also we have this hand of other people participating and profiting. You always have this idea of profit that comes from the Western thought, and creating churches and institutions with the practice. And you know, when this practice was from your home, your church is in your home, and that gives you some sort of feel anchorage in your mind that you have your own practice in your house, and people can come here, and then you go to other people's houses when they're their birthday, and then you share. But the way that this has become a transnational and a money-making machine, supported not only by the practitioners, certain practitioners from which our ancestors might be revolving in their graves, is ridiculous. You know, you have now people that sell soperas for, you know, a lot of money, and then there are people that do this for health, for, you know, needs, psychological needs, for problems. That's the origin, and that's how this started. I don't know how we can make a stop of this, but it has gone beyond what the purpose of the tradition was in many ways.
And unfortunately, you see it's something that happens with a lot of traditions, that erasure, and just kind of like the picking and choosing of certain elements, and then just.
But all this happened in the 70s. It started when salsa came about, the 70s too, when the neoliberal policies created like this idea of everything is money. You can make money out of everything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's everyone to their, you know, save yourself. So how you're gonna make money, figure it out. So in that, you're breaking the essence of being of humanness per se. Why these practices came about, why people being, you know, having issues of depression and anxiety, and they don't have anybody to turn to. So the self is first, and then the community after, you know. And there's always this talk about community, but in many ways I don't see it. You know, what community are you talking about when there's not that minimum, you know, the minimum that you need to have in order to at least have empathy with the other. So yes, and that's why I also became a dancer, you know, because I see it happens in dance pretty much, that you have this idea of that you are connected with spirits, but then nowadays everything is money, and then how can you stop that machine, that global machine?
Do you see any differences and similarities on that idea of like the monetization of elements of the religion here in the U.S. and on the island?
That what, come back again?
That idea of like the monetization and
yes,
are there similarities and differences of how and if that's happening here in the U.S. and in Cuba?
Well, I actually started here with the people that were practicing here in America. Many of the Cubans well, I have to say they've been light-skinned Cubans, the ones that have been initiating all these things, and that's why the question that happened there before. And then the government followed in Cuba, because also, you know, they saw that it was a way of getting money. So again, it's this kind of sort of like a looking down this practice because they're marginal, and then you're able to profit from them and become a guru from them, but then you don't respect the ones that really created it, you know?
Right.
So it's a lot of controversy around this. And then there's ideas of people trying to change the culture and make it mostly like learn the African practices and forget about this one. But I don't see people in Brazil or Haiti doing that. Only Cuba is the center of experiment of the world, you know?
Why do you think that is?
I think because one is the isolation that Cuba has been through for so many years, and two, the economic situation like the country is going through. So everything is this Polish movie from Andrzej Wajda, famous director, called Tout pour vendre, is everything to sell, everything for sale. Yes. So when people, the necessity comes first, survival comes first, and that's why many people in Cuba are surviving. They're selling what we have, like what Black people have is their culture. My sister always said that the only thing that Black people have is their culture, and they have to sell it. And it happened everywhere, not only here. Look at Jamaican dancehall. So yes.
We actually have a question here about the dance company, about IFE-ILE. Do you think IFE-ILE influenced the impact of community dance groups in Miami today?
I think we've been around for 22 years. I think a lot of people that have been able to open groups around are in existence now because of IFE-ILE in many ways. And what we've been doing with the dancers that come and join our company. And there's a space for them whenever they come as immigrants, and also the way we all try to go around and spread the word about the tradition. So yeah, I think that, like LeBron James say, I need respect.
Actually, can you tell us a little bit more about IFE-ILE, and especially, you know, like the conference that you've put together, and the fact that it's, you know, an international, you know, it's not just a South Florida community. This is really an international community that you've
No, it's becoming a monster. Yes.
Yeah, people would be really interested to hear about that. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. I just finished one about 2 weeks ago, and I kind of renamed it Caribbean dance, because I think that there's many stories around the Caribbean that are hidden. Not only, and Cubans are the biggest island of the Caribbean. I think we have a responsibility to, as artists, to also make sure that the other people are seen in our traditions and in our geography that is always hidden. Not only the Cubans are the ones that the irony is that we are the biggest island. We're closed, we're shut down for business. So, but I think that, you know, I think that because of the tradition, we always have this idea of preserving the culture. And what happens is in the conference, it used to be called a festival, and there's a book that I edited together with another wonderful women from the presentations. Now we have an academic part. Is that we present workshops and drumming and other forms of Caribbean dance, and we discuss about them and the situation that these cultures are that lack visibility, and what can we do to improve as practitioners, as academics, and as dancers and artists. So mostly progressively, I've been having the support of so many people like Miami-Dade College, FIU at some point, and in the museum, the HistoryMiami, which I really appreciate all these wonderful ladies behind the scenes. And because what we say in the tradition, one stick doesn't make a forest. You need other people in order to make your vision come true. And so far, I've been steadily growing, and I opened again a chapter of the festival in Barbados, where I was teaching for several years, and that allowed me to have more reach. And with this virtual situation that we have now, we even became bigger for some reason.
Crazy.
So we have people in Barbados. We have people from Japan, from Spain, and then online we have people from the Netherlands, from Switzerland, from places that I wouldn't have thought to have anybody participating.
So I think we only have time for one more question, and since we don't have any, I will selfishly take it. I would like to know, you talked a little bit about collaborations like with us, with FIU. What are some of the things that institutions like museums, like universities, what are some of the things that we can do to help with that idea of like the erasure of the origins of these traditions that we've talked about, of preservation, of facilitating people presenting, telling their own story? What are some of the things that you've seen that worked? What do you want to see for the future?
Well, I have a project right now that I think I want to sell to you guys.
Shoot me an email.
I'm trying to get, I have this idea of this project of, of preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in the era of digitality, I think is important to make sure that we have a documentation of all these forms. So now we look back at pieces from Isadora Duncan and Martha Graham. So I would like the same thing to happening with all these forms in a century from now, if we can have that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Because without these forms that people look down upon so much, all these other styles have built on. Even modern dance came from this idea of cultural hybridization in many ways. So it's important that all these people that contributed to our, the more that we can, because of course we cannot rescue all of them, had their place in history.
Mm. We have one last question, but it's an easy one, so I'll let it slip in. How can people register to take classes?
Well, right now I don't have I just doing the festival once a year because I'm teaching now at UTEP, University of Texas, and I closed the studio, so I just do the conference, and the conference massive for a week, But we have presentations. The company, well, I mean, hopefully, if we don't have any more virus outside, and I don't know when that's going to happen, we will do it. But what we can try to do is opening virtual classes. Excuse me. But I am against those. I adapt because we need to adapt. But then that's one of the quests in our conference. What does it mean for traditions like ours to be virtual?
Oh man.
What do you miss?
Wow.
So we're losing the sense of community. We're losing the idea of transformation. We're losing a lot. I mean, you get a set of steps and you're gonna get fit and you do exercise, but
right.
I don't know if that energy will be there. Even the drums. Yeah, but you have to adapt. I understand we need, and that's how we do it. We did a performance. We did a performance with the dancer that were there, and people were in Jamaica, and then the presenters were in Massachusetts. We had Brenda Dixon presenting. It was really nice, but is it really? We're already losing socialization as it is, and the only thing that is left is dance to make that glue that makes us human, That's music, the arts, and if we are losing it, it's hard. It's just challenging.
Yes.
We need to create with new ideas and new ways of connecting.
Definitely. Well, okay. If there's anything else that you wanted to add, or we can end.
Support the arts, support IFE-ILE, support the museum.
I second that.
Yes.
Neri, thank you so much for your time.
For having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the drink. Salud.
Oh, yes. Cheers. I've been so intrigued by what you're talking about. I left it here.
Mine's hot already, but it's good.
So,
I love sweet things.
And thank you so much also to Gabriel. That was amazing, and this drink is wonderful. I encourage everybody to go out and buy the ingredients and make it.
Está buenísimo.
Yeah, really. So thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the Sip of History program and that you'll join us for the next one. And for more information, you can visit our website at historymiami.org. Thank you and have a great night.
Bye, everybody. Have a good one.